The morning sun sliced across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, casting shadows that clung to the buildings like old secrets. In the window of the general store, a ghost stared back at Emma May. It was her own reflection, trapped behind the glass, pale and thin in a white cotton wedding dress that felt more like a burial shroud. Her hands, all of 19 years old, were pressed against the cold pane, watching the preacher walk toward the saloon. He was probably stopping for a bit of courage before presiding over the sale of a human soul. Her soul. "Time to go, girl." The voice was Mr. Hutchkins, the store owner who'd taken her in when her pa died in the mines, and her ma followed him 6 months later from a broken heart. He was a good man, mostly, but his hands trembled as he counted the stack of gold coins on the counter for the 10th time. $40. That was her price. That was the sum old Samuel Morrison had paid for her hand, her future, her life. Her reflection stared back, pale blue eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Auburn hair braided so tight it pulled at her scalp, just like her mama used to do. "I ain't ready," she whispered to the glass, a prayer that had no chance of being answered. "Ready or not, child," Hutchkins grumbled, not meeting her gaze. "Morrison's waiting at the church. The man's been patient. Patient, like a vulture is patient." Through the window, she saw him. Samuel Morrison, 63 years old, with a scraggly gray beard stained brown with tobacco juice. He sat atop his fine horse like a bloated king, surveying his new property. He'd buried 2 wives already. Emma was to be the 3rd. The thought made a cold dread coil in her stomach. But then, another figure. Across the street, half hidden in the long shadow of the livery, a man sat quiet on a black mare. His hat was pulled low, his face obscured, but there was a stillness about him that was louder than all the noise in her head. She'd seen him before. Every Sunday for the past month, he'd ride into town, buy a few things, and just watch. He never spoke much. He never caused trouble. He just watched. As if he could feel her stare, he lifted his head. For a split second, their eyes met through the grimy glass. It wasn't a glance. It was something heavier. A current of understanding that passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the cage she was in. He gave the slightest, almost imperceptible touch to the brim of his hat. And then it was over. "Emma!" Hutchkins's hand clamped down on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Now!" Morrison's getting impatient. She tore her eyes away from the stranger, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she looked back, he was gone. Vanished. Only a swirl of dust hung in the air where the black mare had stood. "I'm coming," she said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. But a different voice, deep inside her, whispered something else. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. It felt like a trap door was about to spring open, and she didn't know if she was falling into darkness or into flight. This was just the beginning. Jake Sullivan had been awake for hours. The sun was just a rumor on the horizon, but his internal clock was set to the rhythm of grief and duty. His worn boots hit the rough-hewn floorboards of his small cabin, left, right, a familiar march to the window that looked out over the rolling hills of his modest ranch. This land was his sanctuary and his prison, bought with silence and solitude 15 years ago. At 35, Jake was a man carved from the hard edges of the frontier. His hands were a roadmap of scars from rope burns and branding irons. His face, weathered by a relentless sun, held the kind of stillness that comes from seeing too much. His dark hair was just beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and his green eyes held entire libraries of stories he would never, ever tell. The morning routine was a prayer he recited through action. Feed the horses first, his powerful black mare Midnight, and the old gelding he called Copper. Check the fence line that seemed to unravel every night under the weight of the wind. Milk the lone cow that was more company than livestock. Then, finally, coffee, black, strong, and bitter, just like the memories that came with the dawn. Most folks in Cedar Ridge knew him only as the quiet one. A polite nod in town, bills paid on time, a quick departure before conversation could take root. They saw a simple rancher. They didn't see the ghost that rode with him. They didn't know that 15 years ago Jake Sullivan had been a different man entirely. The memory hit him, sharp and punishing, as it did every morning. Jake at 20, cocky and loud, his heart full of California dreams. He was riding beside his older brother, Thomas, their laughter kicking up more dust than their horses. "We're gonna be rich, little brother," Thomas had boomed, his smile as wide as the Montana sky. "Rich enough to buy the biggest spread in the West, find ourselves a couple of pretty wives, and raise a whole mess of kids." Jake's hand instinctively went to the silver cross that hung around his neck, the metal cool against his skin. It was the only thing he had left of Thomas, the only thing that survived the raid. The Apaches had come at dawn, a whirlwind of violence and war cries. They took the horses, the supplies, and his brother's life. They left Jake with a jagged bullet scar across his ribs and a silence that had grown into a fortress around his heart. He'd stumbled into Cedar Ridge not looking for gold, but for a place to bury his past. He built this cabin with his own 2 hands, hoping the physical labor could exhaust the ghosts. It never did. The echoes of his brother's laughter were in every sunrise. Loneliness was an old coat he wore every day. It was familiar, threadbare, but still impossibly heavy. He'd tried once or twice. There was a girl from a church social, and later, a widow who baked pies and tried too hard to fill the silence with her chatter. But each time a woman got close enough to see the cracks in his fortress, the memory of Thomas and their shattered dream would rise up like a wall of stone. He'd retreat, pulling back into the safety of his shell. Better to be alone than to risk losing someone again. But something had shifted a month ago. It started the first time he saw the girl in the general store window, Emma May. He didn't know her name then, but he knew the look in her eyes. It was the same trapped, haunted look he saw in his own reflection every morning. She was a prisoner, just like him, only her bars were made of small-town expectations and poverty. Then, he'd heard the whispers in town. Old man Morrison, puffing out his chest and bragging about the young bride he'd purchased. Hutchkins, counting his gold coins with a mix of relief and shame. It made Jake's jaw clench, made his hands curl into fists at his sides. "Ain't none of your business, Sullivan," he'd told himself every Sunday for the past month. "Stay quiet, stay alone, stay safe." But he kept riding to town, he kept watching her through that window, and he kept feeling a flicker of something in the cold, dead ashes of his heart. A part of him he thought had died with Thomas was stirring. Today was different. Today, he'd seen her in that white dress. She wasn't a bride. She was a sacrifice being led to the altar. And as he watched her, pale and trembling, the walls he'd spent 15 years building crumbled to dust. Thomas's last words echoed in his ears, a promise he'd failed to keep. "Live for both of us, Jake. Do what's right." He urged Midnight into a steady lope, the horse sensing the change in him, the sudden, sharp sense of purpose. The sun was on his back, but a fire was lit in his soul. For the first time in 15 years, Jake Sullivan was riding toward trouble instead of away from it. For the first time in 15 years, he was about to break his silence. The church bell of Cedar Ridge tolled, each clang a hammer blow against Emma May's skull. It wasn't a call to celebration. It was a death knell. She sat stiffly in the front pew, the white cotton of her dress spread around her feet like a pool of spilled milk. At the altar, Samuel Morrison, reeking of sweat and self-satisfaction, adjusted his string tie for the 4th time. "Where in blazes is that preacher?" Morrison grumbled, his voice echoing in the cavernous silence of the mostly empty church. "A man's got cattle to tend." Emma's hands were ice-cold, trembling in her lap. Behind her, the whispers of the few townspeople who'd bothered to show up were like the buzzing of flies. It wasn't a wedding. It was a spectacle. A business transaction given the thinnest veneer of holiness. "Poor child," she heard Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile whisper. "She looks like a ghost." "Morrison's got money, though," came the pragmatic reply from another woman. "She'll never go hungry." "Fed and housed ain't the same as loved," Mrs. Henderson shot back, her voice sharp. Near the back of the church, Mr. Hutchkins paced, his face a mask of guilt. He'd raised her. He'd been the closest thing to a father she'd ever known. He'd taught her to read, helped her with sums at the store, and listened to her read from the paper when his eyes grew tired. For 12 years, she had been his shadow, the daughter he never had. But the store was failing. Debts were piling up like winter snow, and Morrison's offer had been a lifeline. 40 gold coins, a girl's future for a man's solvency. He'd told himself it was for her own good, that a wealthy rancher could offer her a better life, but the lie sat in his gut like a stone. "Mr. Hutchkins," Emma's voice was a fragile thread of sound. "Please, can I have just one more minute?" Before he could answer, the heavy church doors swung open with a bang that made everyone jump. Preacher Williams stumbled in, his black coat covered in dust, his face red and slick with sweat. Apologies, everyone," he wheezed, clutching his side. "Had to tend to old Mrs. Cooper. Her time has come, and she was asking for her last rites." Morrison's face curdled. "Preacher, I am paying you for a wedding, not a eulogy. Let's get on with it." "Of course, Mr. Morrison, of course." The walls were closing in. Emma could feel the air getting thick, hard to breathe. In moments, she would be Mrs. Samuel Morrison. She would live in his big, empty house 20 miles from town, a prisoner in gilded cage. She would cook his meals, tend to his needs, and share his bed. The thought was so vile it made her stomach heave. "Stand up, girl," Morrison commanded from the altar. Like a puppet whose strings had been pulled, Emma's legs obeyed. She rose, her body moving without her permission, but as she took a shaky step forward, the church doors opened again. This time, there was no bang, just a quiet creak that somehow commanded more attention than all of Morrison's blustering. Jake Sullivan stepped inside. He held his hat in his hands, his shoulders filling the doorway. His green eyes, steady and calm, swept over the scene, taking in Morrison's impatience, Hutchkins's guilt, and the fear in her own face. He walked halfway down the aisle, his boots echoing in the sudden, absolute silence. He stopped, a solid, unmovable presence in the middle of her nightmare. "Preacher," Jake said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of thunder. "Before you start those vows, I've got something to say." Morrison spun around, his face turning a shade of mottled purple. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, Sullivan? This is a private affair." "Just speaking my piece," Jake said, but his eyes never left Emma's. In their depths, she saw something she had never seen in another man's face. Not pity, not desire, it was respect. "Miss Emma," he said, his voice softening just for her, "I'm just wondering, is this what you truly want?" The church exploded into a hive of frantic whispers. Morrison began shouting about contracts and property. Hutchkins stammered about debts and difficult times. The townspeople buzzed with the shock of it all. But Emma heard none of it. All she could hear was the wild, hopeful beating of her own heart. She looked at this quiet cowboy, this stranger who had watched over her from a distance, who had now ridden into her darkest hour like a hero from a storybook. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she found her voice. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "What's that?" Morrison boomed, cupping a hand to his ear. "No," she said again, louder this time, her spine straightening, her chin lifting. "This is not what I want." In a flash, Morrison's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His fingers dug into her skin like claws. "You don't get to want, girl. You are bought and paid for." That's when Jake Sullivan moved. It wasn't fast, but it was inevitable. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, deliberate strides. His hand, scarred and calloused, closed over Morrison's wrist with the kind of strength that came from wrestling steers and breaking wild horses. "Let her go," Jake said. His voice was as quiet as winter snow, but it carried the chilling promise of an avalanche. "You have no right," Morrison spat, his face contorted with rage. "Every decent man has the right to stop this," Jake replied, his grip tightening. Morrison winced, his fingers loosening their hold on Emma. A woman is not a piece of cattle to be sold at market. Hutchkins scurried forward, his face pale and sweating. "Jake, you don't understand. The debts. I owe money." "I understand plenty," Jake said, his eyes still locked on Morrison. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. He turned his gaze to Hutchkins. "How much?" $40. Hutchkins mumbled, ashamed to even say the number. Jake didn't flinch. He untied the pouch and deliberately counted out the gold coins into Hutchkins's trembling, outstretched hand. "There's your $40. Now Miss Emma isn't bought by anyone." Morrison's face went from purple to a terrifying, bloodless white. "You can't do this. I have papers, a contract." "You have papers saying you bought her from him," Jake said, nodding towards the cowering Hutchkins. "But as I recall, this is America, and in America a person's life is not for sale." He then turned his full attention to Emma, the anger in his eyes melting away, replaced by a gentle concern. He held out his hand to her. "Miss Emma?" But before she could take it, Morrison let out a strange, chilling laugh. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of dawning realization. He looked Jake up and down, a flicker of cold recognition in his eyes. "Sullivan?" Morrison hissed, the name a curse on his lips. "Thomas Sullivan's little brother. Well, I'll be damned, I should have known." The name hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Jake's posture stiffened, the warmth draining from his face. The name wasn't just a name. It was a key, and it had just unlocked a door that Jake had sealed shut 15 years ago. A door that led to a past far darker and more dangerous than anyone in Cedar Ridge could possibly imagine. The air in the church crackled with a new, dangerous tension. The name Thomas Sullivan had changed everything. It wasn't just about a broken wedding anymore. Morrison was looking at Jake not as a rival, but as a ghost from a long-forgotten war. Emma felt the shift instantly. She looked from Morrison's venomous sneer to Jake's suddenly guarded face. The quiet cowboy who had just saved her was now a man with a secret, a dark one, and Morrison held the key. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, his voice flat and hard. He kept his hand extended to Emma, a silent promise in a room that had suddenly become a tinderbox. "Oh, I think you do," Morrison said, his lips curling back from his stained teeth. "Your brother left quite a mess behind him. A lot of powerful people were displeased. They've been looking for what he took for a very long time." Jake's jaw was a line of granite. "My brother is dead." "Is he?" Morrison taunted. "And the things he stole, did they die with him?" He let his gaze sweep over Jake's modest clothes, his worn-down boots, and then his eyes landed on the small, isolated ranch he knew Jake owned. A cruel smile spread across his face. Or did they buy a quiet little life for his baby brother, hiding out at the edge of the world? The townspeople murmured, confused. Hutchkins looked like he was about to faint. This was spiraling far beyond a simple matter of a bride price. This was about something old and bloody. Emma didn't hesitate. She ignored the whispers, ignored Morrison's poisonous words, and placed her hand in Jake's. His skin was rough, but his grip was firm and steady. It felt like the only solid thing in a world that was tilting on its axis. As her fingers closed around his, she felt the cool, hard shape of the silver cross he wore. "Let's go," she whispered. Jake gave a curt nod. He kept himself between her and Morrison as they walked back down the aisle, the eyes of the entire town following their every step. They didn't run. They walked with a defiant dignity that infuriated Morrison more than any insult could. As they reached the church doors, Morrison's voice boomed after them. "You can't hide forever, Sullivan. Cyrus Blackwood has a long memory and a long reach." The name Cyrus Blackwood meant nothing to Emma, but she felt Jake flinch as if he'd been struck. He didn't look back. He just pushed open the doors and led her out into the blinding sunlight, away from the suffocating judgment of the church and into a different, more dangerous kind of uncertainty. The ride to Jake's ranch was silent and tense. Emma sat sideways on Midnight, her hands clutching the back of the saddle, while Jake guided the mare with a grim focus. The rolling hills that should have felt like freedom felt like the walls of a new, larger prison. Who was Thomas Sullivan? Who was Cyrus Blackwood? And who was this quiet, complicated man who had just saved her, only to pull her into a mystery that felt far more threatening than a miserable marriage? When they arrived at the small, tidy cabin, it was clear it was a place built for one. A single chair sat by the cold hearth. A single cup was on the small table. It was a home built for solitude, a fortress against the world, and she had just breached its walls. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they sat on the porch, a chasm of unspoken questions between them. Emma had changed out of the wedding dress, which she'd left in a heap on the floor, and into a spare work shirt of Jake's that hung on her like a tent. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Back there. For me." "Yes, I did," Jake said, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Some things a man can't walk away from. Morrison, he knows you," she pressed gently. He said a name. Cyrus Blackwood. Jake was silent for a long time, the muscles in his jaw working. He finally reached up and pulled the silver cross from beneath his shirt, the chain leaving a mark on his sun-darkened skin. His thumb traced the worn edges of the metal. "Thomas gave me this," he said, his voice rough. We were partners. We were heading for California to make our fortune." He told her a story, but Emma sensed it was a story with holes, a carefully edited version of the truth. He told her about the dream of a horse ranch, about his brother's laughter, about the Apache raid that had taken him. He told her about the bullet scar on his ribs and the loneliness that followed. It was a sad story, a tragic story, but it didn't explain the look in Morrison's eyes. It didn't explain the name Cyrus Blackwood. As he spoke, holding the cross in his palm, Emma leaned closer. The setting sun caught the silver, and she saw it. It wasn't just a simple cross. Etched into the back, so small and faint it was almost invisible, was a strange symbol. It looked like a serpent biting its own tail, coiled around a single, sharp mountain peak. It was intricate, deliberate, and it felt like a secret. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the symbol. Jake glanced down, his face unreadable. "Just a marking. It was my father's." He quickly tucked the cross back under his shirt, a gesture that was both protective and dismissive. He was hiding something. He had saved her from one prison, but he was still locked inside his own, and she was locked in there with him now. The conversation died. An uneasy quiet settled over the porch. Jake was a wall she couldn't seem to break through. He had shared a piece of his pain, but not the whole truth. As darkness fell, a coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the feeling in her own heart. She was free from Morrison, but she was no closer to understanding the man who had freed her. All she knew was that his past was not buried. It was alive, and it was hunting him. And now, it was hunting her too. Samuel Morrison did not sit and stew. He was not a man who accepted defeat. Humiliation was a fire in his belly, and Jake Sullivan had poured gasoline on it. After storming out of the church, he didn't ride back to his sprawling ranch. He rode straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a large, doughy man who seemed permanently settled behind his cluttered desk, as if he'd grown there like a fungus. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption to his afternoon nap, but his expression changed when he saw the thunder on Morrison's face. "Trouble, Samuel?" Brody asked, swinging his boots off the desk. "The Sullivan boy," Morrison spat, slamming his hand down on the desk, rattling an inkwell. "He's here, in Cedar Ridge." Sheriff Brody went very still. The lazy, comfortable look in his eyes sharpened into something keen and dangerous. "Thomas Sullivan?" "No, the younger one. Jake." Morrison began to pace the small, dusty office like a caged animal. "Showed up at my wedding. My wedding," he repeated, the words laced with venom. "Made a public spectacle, paid off that fool Hutchkins, and walked out with the girl." "The girl?" Brody asked, his interest piqued. "The one you were so keen on acquiring?" "She's not important," Morrison snapped, though his clenched fists told a different story. "He is. After all these years, he just shows up here. It can't be a coincidence." Brody leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming a soft rhythm on the armrest. 15 years, Samuel. That's a long time. Blackwood had all but given up. "Blackwood never gives up," Morrison corrected him. "He waits, and he pays men like us to wait with him. He wants his ledger. He's always wanted his ledger. Thomas Sullivan was a loose end, and now his brother just appears on my doorstep. He has to know something. He has to have it." The sheriff stood up and walked to a tall filing cabinet in the corner. He fumbled with a ring of keys, unlocked a deep drawer, and pulled out a rolled-up, yellowed piece of paper. He spread it carefully on his desk. It was a wanted poster, the ink faded by time. The sketch was of a younger man, cocky and smiling, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. Wanted Thomas Sullivan for robbery and horse theft, $500 reward issued by the Blackwood Mining and Railroad Company. "So," Brody said, looking from the poster to Morrison, "the official story was an Apache raid." "A story I paid good money to circulate," Morrison confirmed. "It was cleaner that way, less questions. My posse was supposed to get the ledger and leave no witnesses. They only got one of those things right. The little brother apparently survived." "And now he's here," Brody mused, "with the girl you were supposed to use as bait. You figured if you put down roots here, made a life, and he ever came sniffing around his brother's last known trail, you could get close to him through her." "It was a sound plan," Morrison insisted. "Hutchkins was deep in my debt. He swore the girl had no ties, no prospects. She was perfect. A lonely girl for a lonely man. Sullivan was bound to notice her, but I didn't expect him to make a move this bold, this public." Sheriff Brody rolled up the poster with a decisive snap. "Well, his boldness just made our job easier. We don't need bait anymore. We have him." He slid the poster back into its drawer and locked it. "He's interfered with a legal contract. He's caused a public disturbance. And I have reason to believe he's living on property purchased with stolen funds." A slow, predatory smile spread across Brody's face. "I think it's time the law paid a visit to the quiet Mr. Sullivan. We won't go in guns blazing. We'll be official, civil. We'll bring him in for questioning." He picked up his gun belt from a peg on the wall and began to buckle it around his ample waist. "And once we have him in a cell, we'll have all the time in the world to persuade him to tell us where his brother hid Mr. Blackwood's property." Morrison's rage began to subside, replaced by a cold, calculating satisfaction. "And the girl?" "The girl," Sheriff Brody said, settling his hat on his head, "is a material witness. For her own safety, she'll need to be placed in the care of a respectable citizen, a man like you, for instance." He gave Morrison a conspiratorial wink. "Once Sullivan is gone, she'll see sense. She'll have no one else to turn to. The plan was perfect. It was legal. It was clean. Jake Sullivan had tried to be a hero, and all he'd done was walk himself straight into the very trap he'd been hiding from for 15 years. The law was coming for him, and in a town run by Cyrus Blackwood's money, the law was just another word for a loaded gun. The next afternoon, the peace of Jake's ranch was shattered by the rhythmic thud of approaching hoofbeats. It wasn't one horse, it was several. Jake was at the fence line, mending a split rail, when he heard them. He straightened up, his body instantly alert. A deep-seated instinct honed by years of looking over his shoulder, screaming that this was not a friendly visit. Emma was by the water pump, her back to the road. "Jake," she called out, sensing the change in his posture. "What is it?" "Get inside the cabin," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, and stay away from the window." He watched as 4 riders came over the rise. They weren't riding fast, but with a slow, deliberate pace that was somehow more menacing. He recognized Sheriff Brody in the lead, his bulk overflowing the saddle. The other 3 were deputies he'd seen in town, men with hard faces and guns tied low on their hips. This wasn't a social call. This was official. Emma hesitated in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale with worry. "Jake, what's happening?" "Just do as I say," he commanded, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. He dropped his hammer and walked slowly to the center of his yard, his hands open and away from his body. He would not give them an excuse. Sheriff Brody's posse pulled up, forming a loose semicircle around him, cutting off any path of escape. The air was thick with unspoken threat. "Afternoon, Sullivan," Brody said, his tone deceptively pleasant. He didn't dismount. "Quite a little spread you've got here. Must have cost a fair bit." "It's honest," Jake replied, his voice level. "What do you want, Sheriff?" "Got a few questions for you is all," Brody said, hooking a thumb in his belt. "Seems you caused quite a stir in town yesterday. Interrupted a wedding, I hear. That's a serious thing, interfering with a legal contract." "The girl didn't want to marry him," Jake said simply. "That should be law enough." "Ah, but it isn't," Brody said with a sigh. "And that's not all. We have reason to believe this property," he gestured around at the cabin, the barn, the neat fences, "was purchased with funds that weren't exactly legitimate." Jake's blood ran cold. This was it. The past had finally caught up. "I bought this land with money I earned on cattle drives." It was a partial lie. Some of it was from cattle drives. The rest was from the stash Thomas had given him before they made their final fateful ride. From inside the cabin, Emma watched through a crack in the door, her heart pounding. She saw the sheriff, his face a mask of smug authority. She saw Jake, standing alone and defiant in the face of 4 armed men. The law had arrived. The men who were supposed to protect people were here to threaten the only person who had protected her. She had a choice: trust the badge and the men who wore it, or trust the quiet, haunted man who had risked everything for her. It wasn't a choice at all. "That's not what we hear," Brody was saying, his voice turning hard. "We hear your brother, Thomas Sullivan, was a wanted man, a thief, and we think he gave you his score before he conveniently disappeared." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the wanted poster. He let it unfold, revealing Thomas's smiling face to the world. "Ring any bells, Sullivan?" Jake stared at his brother's face, a ghost from 15 years ago, now being used as a weapon against him. "My brother's dead," he said, his voice raw. "We'll be the judge of that," Brody said. "You're under arrest, Sullivan, on suspicion of theft and possession of stolen property." He nodded to one of his deputies. "Cuff him." As the deputy dismounted and approached with a set of iron shackles, Jake knew he had seconds to act. He couldn't go with them. A cell in Brody's jail was a death sentence. Blackwood's men would get to him, and they would tear the truth from him one way or another. And Emma. What would happen to Emma? He could see it all playing out. She'd be left alone, vulnerable, and Morrison would swoop in like the vulture he was. He had to get her away. He glanced toward the cabin, a silent, desperate prayer that she would understand. Then he looked at the corral, where Midnight and Copper were idly swatting flies, and he made his move. It wasn't an attack. It was a diversion. With a sudden, explosive yell, Jake kicked over a lantern sitting by the barn door. It wasn't lit, but the clatter and the sudden movement were enough. He then sprinted, not away, but directly toward the corral, unlatching the gate as he ran past. "Yeah! Get!" he roared, slapping Copper on the rump. The old gelding, startled, bolted from the corral, followed by the much faster Midnight. The horses thundered across the yard, scattering the deputies' mounts and causing chaos. In that one moment of confusion, Jake didn't run. He turned back to the cabin. "Emma, now!" he screamed. The door flew open and she ran out, her eyes wide with terror and trust. He didn't have time to explain. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the dense woods that bordered the back of his property. Gunshots rang out behind them, the bullets whistling past their heads and thudding into the trees. They plunged into the shadows of the forest, branches whipping at their faces, their lungs burning. They were fugitives, running from the law, running from a ghost named Cyrus Blackwood, running from a past that refused to stay dead. And as they ran, hand in hand, Emma knew one thing for certain. Jake Sullivan's quiet life was over, and her new life had just begun. They ran until their lungs felt like they were on fire, until the sounds of the posse faded behind them, swallowed by the dense woods. They finally collapsed at the base of a towering pine, gasping for air, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving them shaky and cold. They were alive. They were free. But they were fugitives, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The silence that fell between them was heavy with unspoken things. The sun began to set, casting long, deep shadows through the trees, mirroring the darkness of their situation. Finally, Emma found her voice, though it was raspy and breathless. "Jake, you have to tell me. You have to tell me everything." It wasn't a question. It was a demand. She had run with him, trusted him, and now she deserved the truth. All of it. Jake looked at her, his face grim in the fading light. He saw the determination in her eyes, the fear, but also an unwavering strength he hadn't seen before. She wasn't the timid girl from the general store anymore. This ordeal was forging her into something new, something stronger. He owed her the truth. He took a deep breath, the confession he had held in for 15 years, finally rising to the surface. "Morrison was right," he began, his voice low and full of self-loathing. "My brother. Thomas wasn't just a dreamer. He was a thief." The words hung in the air, stark and ugly. "He worked for Cyrus Blackwood," Jake continued, the story tumbling out of him now, a torrent of buried memories. "Blackwood owns mines, railroads. He owns politicians and sheriffs. He's more like a king than a businessman. Thomas was one of his accountants. He was smart, charming, and greedy. He saw how Blackwood operated, skimming profits, blackmailing rivals, buying justice, so Thomas decided to take a piece for himself. He stared into the darkening woods, but he was seeing the past. He didn't just steal money. He stole Blackwood's ledger, the book that had everything in it, every bribe, every crime, every name. It was his insurance policy. He thought he could use it to blackmail Blackwood and live like a king. "We weren't heading to California to buy a ranch," Jake admitted, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "We were running. Thomas told me he'd won a fortune in a poker game. I was 20 years old and I worshipped him. I believed every word he said. The men who attacked us in that canyon. They weren't Apache," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They were a posse, sent by Blackwood, led by Morrison. Their job was to get the ledger and kill us both. They got Thomas. I was left for dead." He finally looked at Emma, his green eyes filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. "I've been hiding ever since. This ranch, the quiet life. It was all a lie, a way to stay off Blackwood's map. I came to Cedar Ridge because it was small, forgotten. The last place anyone would look for me. I never touched the money Thomas stole. I left it with him, buried in that canyon, but I used the money he'd saved from before, the honest money, to buy my land. Still, the rest of it, the secret, has been a poison in my soul for 15 years. Emma listened, her mind racing, processing the awful truth. Jake wasn't a hero who had stumbled into trouble. He was a man who had been running from it his entire adult life. He was the brother of a thief, hunted by a powerful, ruthless man. And by saving her, he had led them right to his door. She could leave. She could walk away right now, try to make her way to another town, disappear. No one would blame her. She had escaped one monster only to find herself tied to a man with his own demons, his own dangerous past. But then she thought of the look in Morrison's eyes back at the church, the cold, chilling recognition. And then, the way he'd looked at her. It wasn't just about a broken marriage contract. He wanted her. Why? It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. Morrison wasn't just a jilted suitor, he was Blackwood's man. He had been waiting in Cedar Ridge, waiting for Jake, and she had been the bait. Her life, her future, had been nothing more than a piece on a chessboard in a game she didn't even know was being played. Anger, hot and fierce, burned through her fear. They hadn't just tried to buy her. They had tried to use her. Her gaze fell to Jake's chest, to the spot where the silver cross lay hidden beneath his shirt, the symbol she had seen etched on the back, the serpent and the mountain. "That symbol," she said, her voice sharp with sudden realization. "On your cross." Jake looked at her, confused by the sudden change of topic. "What about it?" "I've seen it before," she said, her mind working furiously. "I used to help Mr. Hutchkins with his books, tallying accounts for ranchers and businesses in the area. There was one big account, for a company I didn't recognize, the Blackwood Mining and Railroad Company." Jake sat up straighter, his eyes locking with hers. "He used a brand, a symbol, next to all his entries in the ledger," she continued, the memory becoming clearer. "To mark them as his. It wasn't the full name. It was just a symbol." She reached out and took a stick, and in the soft dirt at their feet, she drew it from memory. A serpent, biting its own tail, coiled around a single sharp mountain peak. It was the exact same symbol. The cross wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a link, a clue. And it meant that the history between the Sullivans and Blackwood went deeper than one stolen ledger. It was a connection that was older, more personal. And whatever secret that cross held, it was now the only thing that might save them. The revelation hung between them in the cold night air. The symbol on the cross, the same one from Blackwood's account book in a dusty general store miles away, was too much for coincidence. It was a thread, connecting Jake's family to the most dangerous man in the territory in a way he had never imagined. "My father," Jake said, his voice strained. "Thomas told me the cross was my father's and his father's before him. He was a stonemason, a simple man. What connection could he have to a man like Blackwood?" "Maybe he wasn't so simple," Emma suggested, her mind racing. "This changes things, Jake. This isn't just about a ledger your brother stole. This is older, deeper. And that book, Hutchkins's book, it might hold more answers." A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in her mind. "We have to go back." "Back?" Jake looked at her as if she were insane. "Emma, there's a posse hunting us. Morrison knows the woods. Brody knows the law. Going back to Cedar Ridge is suicide." "It's the only move we have left," she insisted, her voice gaining a strength that surprised them both. "They'll expect us to run, to head for the mountains or another territory. They won't expect us to double back, to hide in plain sight. We need to see that account book. We need to know what Hutchkins knows." He saw the logic in her words, as reckless as it sounded. A cornered animal's best defense is to do the unexpected, but the risk was immense. "And what about Hutchkins?" Jake argued. "He sold you to Morrison. He's not our friend." "He sold me because he was in debt to Morrison," Emma reasoned. "He's a weak man, not an evil one. I saw the guilt in his eyes. He raised me, Jake. He might be the only person in that whole town who could be turned to our side, if we can get to him. If we can make him understand that Morrison is part of something far worse than just a bad marriage." The plan was a sliver of hope in a sea of darkness. They were out of options. Hiding in the woods would only delay the inevitable. They had to go on the offensive. They waited until the moon was high, a pale ghost in the sky, before they began to move. They traveled through the thickest parts of the woods, circling around Cedar Ridge, approaching it from the north, the opposite direction from which they'd fled. It took them the rest of the night. By the time the first hints of dawn were painting the sky, they were hidden in a thicket of trees on a hill overlooking the sleeping town. The general store stood dark and silent on the main street. A single light burned in the window of the sheriff's office. The posse was still out, or Brody was waiting. "We wait for full light," Jake whispered, his body tense. "When people are moving around, we'll be less conspicuous." They watched as the town slowly came to life. A baker firing up his oven, a stable hand mucking out stalls. Finally, they saw Mr. Hutchkins, looking older and more stooped than ever, emerge from his rooms above the store to sweep the boardwalk. His movements were slow, burdened. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Now," Emma said. They moved like shadows, sticking to the alleyways and the backs of buildings. The town felt alien and hostile. Every slammed door, every barking dog made them jump. They slipped in through the back door of the store, a door Emma had used 1,000 times, its familiar creak now sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. It was the smell of Emma's entire life. They found the heavy account book on a shelf behind the counter, right where it always was. Emma's hands trembled as she opened it, flipping through the pages, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers she knew so well. "Here," she whispered, pointing. The Blackwood account. There it was, page after page of transactions, dates, and sums, and next to each one, the symbol of the serpent and the mountain. But as she scanned the entries, she saw something else. It wasn't just about mining supplies or railroad shipping costs. There were names of people, listed as expenses, and dates, some of them going back 20 years. "Jake," she said, her blood running cold, "this isn't an account book. It's a record of payments, bribes. Look, Sheriff Brody's name is here, from 10 years ago." They were staring at the roots of Blackwood's power, the network of corruption that held the entire territory in its grip. But why would Hutchkins have a copy of this? "I knew you'd come back." The voice made them both freeze. They looked up to see Mr. Hutchkins standing in the doorway to the back room, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. His face was a wreck of fear and regret. "I knew you weren't the kind to just run," he said, his voice cracking. "Put the gun down, Mr. Hutchkins," Emma said softly. "We're not here to hurt you. We need answers." Tears welled in the old man's eyes. "He made me do it, Emma. Morrison, he's not who he seems. He came to town years ago. He knew things about me. A debt I had back in Kansas, a long time ago. He said he'd ruin me, tell everyone. He said all I had to do was watch you, and watch the quiet man on the hill. Report back if he ever showed an interest in you." Hutchkins's story came tumbling out, a confession of weakness and fear. Morrison was Blackwood's man, a patient spider waiting in his web. Hutchkins was forced to be his eyes and ears. The sale of Emma had been the final turn of the screw, a way to force a confrontation between her and Jake. "He doesn't just want a ledger," Hutchkins whispered, the shotgun now pointing at the floor. "It's more than that. It's about what your father knew, Jake, what he built." He looked at the cross around Jake's neck. That symbol. Blackwood didn't create it. He stole it. It was your family's mark, the mark of the Sullivan Masons. Your father and his brother. They were the best stonemasons in the territory. Blackwood hired them to build him a vault, a secret place in the mountains to hide his wealth, his records, everything. He paid them a fortune and made them swear an oath of secrecy on that cross. The truth was a physical blow. Jake staggered back, his hand flying to the cross. His father wasn't a simple artisan. He was the architect of Blackwood's secrets. But your father was an honest man, Hutchkins continued, his voice urgent. He grew to regret what he'd built. He knew he'd created a fortress for a tyrant. Before he died, he told your brother Thomas where the vault was and how to get in. He made Thomas promise to one day expose Blackwood, to use his own fortress against him. Stealing that ledger wasn't just greed, Jake. It was Thomas trying to fulfill your father's last wish. He was just too reckless about it. Suddenly, a bell on the front door of the store jangled violently. They all froze. Through the front window, they could see Sheriff Brody and 2 of his deputies dismounting, their hands on their guns. Someone had seen them. "They know you're here," Hutchkins gasped, his face ashen. Morrison must have had someone watching the store. He looked from the approaching lawman to Jake and Emma, a lifetime of cowardice warring with a flicker of desperate courage. He made a decision. "The ledger is your only chance," he said, shoving a canvas sack filled with food and ammunition into Jake's hands. "It's the only thing that can bring down Blackwood and everyone on his payroll, including Brody. It proves everything." "Where is it?" Jake demanded. "Where did Thomas hide it?" "He told me once in a letter, just in case something happened to him," Hutchkins said, his eyes wild with fear and urgency. "He said he hid it where his heart lies." The words made no sense. The front door of the store burst open. "Sullivan, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." Hutchkins shoved them toward the back room. "Go. Through the cellar, it comes out in the alley 3 buildings down. I'll buy you time." Before they could argue, he turned and fired the shotgun into the ceiling. Plaster and dust rained down, creating a cloud of confusion. "He hid it where his heart lies," Hutchkins yelled again over the deputies' shouts. Jake grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her into the darkness of the cellar, the old man's final desperate words echoing in his ears. Where his heart lies. What did it mean? He had no time to think. They were plunging back into the dark, armed with a truth that was more dangerous than any lie and a riddle that held the key to their survival. The cellar was a maze of dusty barrels and cobwebs, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and aging root vegetables. Jake and Emma scrambled through the darkness, guided by a sliver of light from a grimy window grate at the far end. Behind them, they heard shouting, the crash of overturned shelves, and then a single, sickeningly final gunshot that echoed through the floorboards above. Emma cried out, a small strangled sound. Jake pulled her close, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. Hutchkins had bought them their time. The cowardly man had found his courage at the very end. They couldn't let his sacrifice be for nothing. They forced open the cellar doors and tumbled out into a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway. The town was in an uproar, people running toward the sound of the shot at the general store. The chaos was their cover. They slipped from the alley, stole 2 horses from the livery stable while the owner was distracted, and rode hard out of town, heading west, away from the rising sun. They rode for hours, pushing the stolen horses, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Cedar Ridge. The grief for Hutchkins was a sharp pain in Emma's chest, but it fueled a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about their survival. It was about justice. For Hutchkins, for Jake's father, for Thomas. When they finally stopped in a hidden arroyo to let the horses rest, the riddle consumed them. "Where his heart lies," Emma repeated, pacing the sandy wash. "What does it mean? A person? A place?" "Thomas's heart was always in one place," Jake said grimly. "The future, the goldfields of California, The ranch we were going to build. He shook his head. It's too broad. It could mean anything. He pulled the silver cross from his neck and stared at the symbol of the serpent and the mountain. My father built Blackwood a vault. In the mountains. This has to be the key. A mountain, Emma said, thinking aloud. Is there a famous peak around here? One that looks like the symbol? Jake thought back to the long ride with his brother, trying to recall the landmarks, the conversations. Thomas was the navigator I just followed, but I remember. The night before the raid, we camped in a canyon. He was staring up at the stars. He pointed out a constellation, said it was his favorite. He called it the Serpent's Tooth, said it looked like a snake biting a star. Emma's eyes widened. A constellation. What if the mountain on the cross isn't a real mountain? What if it's a map? A star map? It's possible, Jake conceded, a flicker of excitement cutting through his exhaustion. But we were miles from here, in Apache territory. It would take days to get back there, and Brody and Morrison will be hunting us. They'll think we're running west to the next territory, Emma argued, her conviction growing. They'll never expect us to ride back east, into the heart of the danger, into the very place your brother was killed. It was the logic of the desperate, the strategy of the hunted. They had to go back to the one place on Earth Jake had sworn he would never see again, the canyon where he had buried his brother. The journey was a blur of fear and determination. They rode through the night, slept in short, fitful bursts during the day, and lived off the meager supplies Hutchkins had given them. The landscape grew harsher, the rolling hills giving way to jagged rock and arid plains. This was the land that had haunted Jake's nightmares for 15 years. During the long hours in the saddle, they talked. The walls between them had crumbled, and in their place, a deep, powerful bond was forming. This wasn't a rescuer and his damsel anymore. They were partners, equals in a desperate fight. He saw in her a resilience and courage that humbled him. She saw in him a deep well of honor and goodness, buried under years of pain and guilt. They were two broken pieces that, together, were starting to feel whole. After 3 days of hard riding, they found it. A narrow slash in the earth, a canyon with steep, rocky walls. It was just as he remembered. The air was still and silent, heavy with memory. "This is it," Jake whispered, dismounting. He could feel the ghosts here. They left the horses and proceeded on foot. And then he saw it. A small pile of stones at the base of the canyon wall, overgrown with weeds. His brother's grave, the crude marker he had built with his own hands 15 years ago. He knelt before the grave, the weight of the years pressing down on him, all the guilt, all the regret. It washed over him in a powerful wave. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, her presence a silent comfort. "His heart lies here," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "It has to be here. The ledger must be buried with him." But as he reached out to move the first stone, a voice echoed from the ridge above them, sharp and triumphant. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sullivan." They looked up. Silhouetted against the bright blue sky stood Samuel Morrison and a half-dozen of his hired guns, rifles leveled down at them. They were trapped. Morrison had outguessed them. He had known they would come back. "I knew you were sentimental," Morrison called down, his voice dripping with condescending satisfaction. "Knew you'd eventually come back for your big brother, and for what he stole." He gestured with his rifle. "My men and I have been tracking you since you left Cedar Ridge. A much better posse than the last one I led through this canyon, wouldn't you say?" The admission was casual, chilling. He was the one. He had killed Thomas. "Now," Morrison continued, "here's how this is going to go. You are going to dig up that ledger for me, and in return," he paused, a cruel smile spreading across his face, "I'll give you a choice. The ledger for the girl's life. You can't have both. So, what's it going to be, Sullivan? The past or the future?" The choice was impossible. The thing that could grant him justice, or the woman who had become his entire world. Morrison had him pinned, not just by guns, but by his own heart. The canyon wasn't just a grave. It was a crucible, and it was about to burn away everything but the truth. The sun beat down on the canyon floor, the heat merciless. Jake was trapped, a pawn in a game that had started before he was born. Morrison's ultimatum hung in the air, the ledger or the girl. It was a choice designed to break him. "All right, Morrison," Jake called up, his voice steady despite the hammer in his chest. "You win." He started pulling stones away from the crude grave, his hands raw, his mind racing. This was a stall. He knew it. The ledger wasn't here. It couldn't be. Thomas was reckless, but he wasn't stupid. Burying the proof with his body was too obvious. Where his heart lies. It was a riddle, and the answer wasn't in the dirt. As he worked, Emma's eyes darted around the canyon, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Then her gaze fell on Jake, kneeling at the grave, the silver cross swinging from his neck, and she remembered his words. Thomas was staring at the stars. He called it the serpent's tooth. Her eyes flew to the sky, then to the canyon walls. It was a place of rock and shadow, but it wasn't random. The formations, the peaks and ridges, they formed patterns. And there, on the eastern wall of the canyon, catching the afternoon sun, was a rock formation she hadn't noticed before. A jagged pinnacle of dark rock, with a cluster of smaller white quartz stones just below it, glittering like stars. It looked exactly like a serpent's fang about to strike. "Jake," she whispered urgently, her voice so low the men on the ridge couldn't hear. "The stars. Look at the eastern wall." Jake glanced up from the grave, following her gaze. He saw it instantly. The serpent's tooth. Not in the sky, but carved into the earth itself. His brother's favorite constellation. Where his heart lies. Thomas hadn't loved the ground. He'd loved the stars. He'd loved the dream they represented. The grave was a decoy. The real marker was the mountain itself. At that exact moment, a new sound shattered the canyon's silence. Gunfire. But it wasn't coming from Morrison's men. It erupted from the opposite ridge. A second group of riders had appeared, firing down on Morrison's exposed position. Morrison's men, taken completely by surprise, scattered for cover, returning fire. The canyon descended into a chaotic, echoing battle. "What in the hell?" Morrison roared, whipping his head around. A large, doughy figure stepped into view on the opposite ridge, a rifle in his hands. It was Sheriff Brody. "Sorry, Samuel," Brody shouted over the gunfire, a smug grin on his face. "Mr. Blackwood prefers his packages delivered directly. Decided to cut out the middleman. You're a loose end." It was a double cross. Brody had followed them too, letting Morrison do the dirty work of tracking them down, only to swoop in at the last minute to claim the prize for himself. The canyon was a death trap, a three-way firefight between Morrison's thugs, a corrupt sheriff's posse, and the two people they were all hunting. "Now!" Jake yelled, grabbing Emma's hand. They used the chaos, sprinting across the canyon floor toward the rock formation of the serpent's tooth. Bullets whizzed past them, kicking up dust at their feet. They scrambled up the scree slope, Jake's body shielding Emma's as much as he could. He reached the jagged pinnacle of rock, his hands searching frantically along its base. His fingers found it, a loose stone, its edges smoothed by something other than weather. He pulled. It came free, revealing a dark cavity within the rock, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound book. The ledger. He had it. He pulled it from its hiding place just as a figure appeared above them on the slope. It was Sheriff Brody, his face red with exertion, his pistol aimed directly at Jake's heart. "Hand it over, Sullivan," Brody panted, his chest heaving. "Don't be a fool. Your brother was a fool. Your father was a fool. Don't make it the family trade." Jake stood, the ledger in one hand, Emma behind him. This was the end of the line. There was no escape. But then another shot rang out, clean and true, from the mouth of the canyon. Brody's pistol flew from his hand, clattering down the rocks. The sheriff yelped, clutching his stinging fingers. They all looked toward the source of the shot. Standing there, a smoking rifle in his hands, was the last person they ever expected to see. Mr. Hutchkins. He wasn't dead. He was leaning against a rock for support, a bloody bandage wrapped around his shoulder, but he was alive. And he was there for them. "The girl's my family," Hutchkins called out, his voice shaking but firm. "I'm done letting men like you run the world." The tide had turned. Brody was disarmed, and Morrison, seeing his chance, made one last desperate move. With a roar of pure rage, he ignored the firefight and lunged, not for Jake, but for Emma. Jake didn't hesitate. He shoved Emma out of the way, sending her stumbling safely behind a boulder. He met Morrison's charge head-on, dropping the ledger to the ground. The two men crashed together, a brutal, desperate tangle of fists and fury. This wasn't about a ledger anymore. This was about 15 years of stolen lives, about the woman Morrison had tried to own, and the quiet man who had finally found his voice. The fight was ugly and primitive. They rolled in the dust, trading blows fueled by years of hatred. But Morrison was a man driven by greed. Jake was a man driven by something more powerful, love, and a desperate need for redemption. That strength won out. Jake overpowered him, his hands closing around Morrison's throat, not with the intent to kill, but with the cold, final force of justice. He held him down, pinning the sputtering, defeated man to the ground. The firefight died down. Brody's deputies, seeing their leader disarmed and the situation lost, surrendered to Hutchkins's steady aim. Morrison's remaining men fled into the wilderness. Silence fell over the canyon once more. It was over. Jake stood, breathing heavily, his knuckles bloody. Brody and Morrison were captured. Hutchkins, their unlikely savior, limped toward them, a grim smile on his face. Emma rushed to Jake's side, her hands on his face, her eyes shining with tears and relief. He bent down and picked up the ledger. The heavy book felt like the weight of his entire life. He had it. He had the power to expose Blackwood, to bring down an empire of corruption. He could use it to get rich, to disappear, to finally have the life of peace he'd always craved. He looked at Emma, at the hope in her eyes. He looked at Hutchkins, a man who had found redemption in a single act of courage. He knew what he had to do. Running was over. It was time to fight back, not with fists or guns, but with the truth. They didn't run. They didn't hide. With Morrison and a hog-tied Sheriff Brody in tow, they rode, not west into oblivion, but east, toward the territorial capital. Hutchkins, despite his wound, rode with them, the rifle never leaving his hands. The journey was tense, the weight of the ledger in Jake's saddlebag a constant, heavy presence. It was a bomb, and they were about to detonate it in the heart of the territory's power structure. Hutchkins had told them about one man, a federal marshal named Elias Thorne, a stubborn old bulldog who couldn't be bought and had a long-standing suspicion of Cyrus Blackwood's immaculate reputation. He was their only hope. They arrived in the capital, a bustling, chaotic city that made Cedar Ridge look like a child's playset. They marched their prisoners directly to the marshal's office, causing a stir that brought city life to a standstill. Marshal Thorne was exactly as Hutchkins had described him. A man with flinty eyes, a weathered face, and an aura of incorruptible authority. He listened to their story in silence, his expression unreadable as Jake laid out the tale of his father, his brother, and the 15-year-old crime that had finally come to light. Then, Jake placed the ledger on the marshal's desk. The thud of the book hitting the wood seemed to echo in the silent room. Thorne opened it. He spent nearly an hour reading, his eyes scanning the pages of meticulous, damning evidence. He saw the names, senators, judges, lawmen. He saw the crimes, bribery, extortion, murder. He saw the vast, rotten network that Blackwood had built. When he finally looked up, his face was grim. "I've been chasing this dragon for 10 years, Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "But I never had the proof." He closed the ledger. "Now I do." The fallout was like a seismic shock. Warrants were issued. Arrests were made. Cyrus Blackwood's empire, built on secrets and fear, crumbled under the weight of his own meticulous records. The scandal reached the highest levels of the territorial government, a cleansing fire that burned away the corruption that had festered for decades. For Jake and Emma, the weeks that followed were a blur of depositions and waiting. They were held as material witnesses protected by Marshal Thorne. They weren't treated as heroes or criminals, but as the key that had unlocked the truth. Finally, the verdict came down. The Sullivan name was officially cleared. For his cooperation, Jake was issued a full pardon for the crimes of his flight and theft of horses, along with a substantial reward for his role in bringing Blackwood's organization to justice. Months later, they returned to Cedar Ridge. The town was different, quieter. The shadows of Morrison and Brody were gone. In their place, a sense of weary relief had settled. Hutchkins, who had been lauded as a hero, had reopened the general store, his shoulders straighter, his eyes clear for the first time in years. Jake used the reward money not to build a mansion, but to fortify his small ranch. He bought more land, better stock, and repaired the fences. He and Emma were married in the same small church where her nightmare had almost begun. This time, it was filled with the town's genuine well-wishers. This time, Emma wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and her smile outshone the stained-glass windows. As Preacher Williams, looking profoundly grateful to be presiding over a wedding born of love instead of commerce, asked the eternal questions, Jake looked into Emma's eyes. He saw his past, his present, and a future so bright it almost hurt to look at. "I do," he said, his voice clear and strong. When the preacher turned to Emma, she didn't see a haunted cowboy or the brother of a thief. She saw the man who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. The man who had walked through fire and faced down his own ghosts to give her a choice. The man who had shown her that love wasn't about ownership, but about liberation. "I do," she said, her voice ringing with a joy that filled the church. Years later, visitors to Cedar Ridge would often remark on the beautiful, thriving ranch on the hill outside of town. They'd see a man with kind green eyes and silver-threaded hair working his land, his movements strong and peaceful. They'd see a woman with vibrant auburn hair hanging laundry, laughing as two small children, a boy with his father's eyes and a girl with her mother's spirit, played at her feet. The old-timers in town would tell the story of the quiet cowboy and the girl he'd saved. They'd say that Jake Sullivan still wore his brother's silver cross, but that now it was a symbol not of a burden, but of a promise kept. They'd tell you how Emma Sullivan had started the best little schoolhouse the county had ever seen, teaching children that their worth was not for sale and that they always had a choice. And if you stood on the porch of that ranch at sunset and listened to the wind whispering through the rolling hills, you might hear the echo of the truth that had changed everything. That sometimes the quietest people have the loudest hearts, and that true freedom isn't about running from your past, but turning to face it, hand in hand with the person you love. The quiet cowboy had finally found his voice, and in doing so, he hadn't just saved a girl, he'd saved himself. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales that'll keep you on the edge of your saddle. And let us know in the comments below, what's the bravest thing you've ever done for someone you love? We'll see you in the next one.